Hello. Today's talk is about international trade. We often think that in a global world with its global economy, we can buy and sell things to anywhere, and quite often this is true. For example, I ride an American brand of bicycle which was manufactured in Taiwan using a lot of parts which are of Japanese origin, with wheels from an Italian company that are actually made in Taiwan. My Clark's shoes, which is a British brand of shoe, were actually made in Vietnam. It's confusing, eh? We know that many companies outsource their production to countries where production costs are cheaper. That gives the consumer more choice and better prices, which in turn allows us to consume more, the very basis of capitalism. However, not all products are so easy to buy and sell overseas. Trade deals need to be agreed between countries and groups of countries like the EU. And it's one such agreement that I'd like to talk about today. That is the TTIP, or to give it its full title, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. This is a trade agreement between the USA and the European Union. The talks to agree the deal have been going on for some time now, since June 2013 in fact. Even now, a few years later, there's still not a final agreement between the EU and the US. So what I'd like to do today is explain why the trade deal is seen as necessary, what the problems are with it, and at the end I'll tell you my own views on the subject. So first then, why is the deal necessary? Well, obviously EU and American companies would like to sell their products to as wide a variety of consumers as possible at the best possible price to those consumers. Different products have different tariffs and regulations associated with them. Tariffs means the charges that are imposed by countries for importing products from other countries to sell. Regulations are, for example, the safety standards of different products. Now, tariffs between the EU and the USA average about 3%. So by lowering those tariffs to zero, the British government claims that TTIP could add £10 billion to the UK economy, £80 billion to the US economy, and £100 billion to the EU every year. The government also says that shoppers would benefit by the removal of EU import tariffs on popular goods like jeans and cars. It's also claimed that reducing regulation would help UK businesses exporting to the US, with small businesses in particular predicted to benefit from the lowering of these tariffs. Let's give an example of how current legislation is not helping British business. If, let's say, I am a farmer of sheep and I want to sell my lamb meat, that's the meat from baby sheep, to the USA, I can't. Simple as that. I cannot sell my lamb meat to the USA. If, let's take another example, I am the chief executive of Jaguar Cars, if only, but if I was the chief executive of Jaguar Cars, and I want to sell my cars to the USA, these cars have a 2.5% import tariff, which on a £45,000 car increases the price to £46,350. £45,000 for the car. In terms of a Jaguar, that's low end of their range. Now, these cars also have to pass American safety and emissions tests, which are different to the European safety and emissions tests. All of these tests cost the manufacturer, Jaguar Cars in this case, money, which in turn increases the cost to produce the cars. So it seems, I guess, to make a lot of sense to reduce the tariffs and to harmonise the safety and emissions testing between the EU and the USA. However, and it is a big however, let's consider for a moment the American car-making industry. It was decimated by the arrival of cheap and reliable Japanese cars in the 1980s and 90s. In 2007, the number of workers at the GM, that's General Motors, the GM factory near Detroit, the factory employed just 6,000 workers, compared to 100,000 workers in its heyday in the 1960s. Since then, the number of imported cars has rocketed from about 1.5 million in 1970 to about 4.7 million in the year 2000. The reason for this decline of the US car industry and the rise in imports is that the price of imported cars is cheaper and the quality is often much better. Now, the US car manufacturers obviously do not want to see the imported cars becoming even cheaper through the removal of tariffs, as it would add further pressure to their own sales. As a consumer, why would you spend more to buy a potentially inferior American car when you can buy a much more reliable foreign import? So that's one example of the sticking points of these negotiations. The two parties, the EU and the USA, need to protect the interests of their nations, in this case the car manufacturers, while at the same time to help their own nations to broaden their potential market. It's very difficult to, as the saying goes, have your cake and eat it. Another example to illustrate the problem is in the supply of food. I already mentioned the fact that a UK supplier of lamb cannot sell that meat in America. Now, the Europeans are worried that opening the EU door to American food will severely damage EU agriculture. I'll explain why. You see, American legislation on food standards is far below those of the European Union. For example, 70% of processed foods sold in the US now contain genetically modified ingredients. By contrast, the EU allows virtually no GM foods. Secondly, the US also uses far more pesticides than the EU. It also uses growth hormones in its beef, and those hormones are restricted in Europe because of the links to cancer. Now, these 3 points make food produced in the USA much cheaper than in Europe. Therefore, American food imports would be cheaper than EU produced food if it was sold in the EU. The EU obviously needs to protect its own agriculture, so is very resistant to agreeing to trade deals that involve what I would describe as substandard and potentially dangerous food. There are many other issues which I'm afraid I don't have time to explain. However, I would like to touch on one which is of great concern. The Independent newspaper in the UK reported that TTIP's biggest threat to society is its assault on democracy. This is because one of the main aims of TTIP is the introduction of something called Investor State Dispute Settlements, or ISDS. This means that companies will be able to sue or claim money from governments if those governments' policies cause the company a loss of profits. In effect, it means that unelected transnational corporations can dictate the policies of democratically elected governments. Let me give you an example to explain this. In Australia, in 2011, The elected government made laws to make cigarette packaging plain brown with no logos. Hence, buyers could ask for a particular brand of cigarettes in the shop, but the packet of cigarettes would not have the brand written on it. Think of the almost iconic red and white Marlboro cigarette packet. In Australia, it's no longer red and white, just plain brown, with Marlboro written in very small letters. The Australian government felt that this new law would reduce consumption of cigarettes, and they were right. However, the tobacco companies obviously did not want this new law to be made, so they fought against it. Eventually they lost and the law was passed, as I said, in 2011. Now, Philip Morris, the makers of Marlboro, tried to sue the Australian government for loss of profits due to the plain packaging. Philip Morris eventually lost this legal battle. But the very fact that a multinational company can even think about changing national policy is, to me, somewhat worrying. I have briefly outlined why this TTIP is seen as a necessary step forward in global trade, and I have detailed for you some of the problems that the negotiators have tried to, and indeed are trying to, overcome. And I hope that you have noticed that I'm not really a fan of this trade deal. While I and most others would welcome more choice and more competitive prices in the shops, I'm very concerned about the driving down of quality and safety of products, particularly food, if this deal is ever completed. So, thank you.